You ever care so deeply for someone that you start shrinking yourself just to keep their love? That's the story of the super empath. They're the ones who love without reservation, who see the flicker of potential in someone emotionally unavailable and try to keep that flame alive, even if it burns them. And then there's the avoidant, mysterious, hot one day, cold the next. Their power, distance, their fuel, your effort. But here's what no one tells you. The empath only loses until they learn the game isn't worth playing. The empath's power isn't their ability to chase. It's their ability to walk away with their empathy intact. One day, the empath wakes up and realizes, I am not addicted to fixing you. I'm addicted to being chosen. And if you can't do that, I'll choose myself. That's the day everything changes. Because the avoidant expects you to cling, to beg, to double down on love. That's their script. But the super empath who learns their worth, who stops over functioning, they don't just walk away. They exit with grace and leave a silence the avoidant can't manipulate. And when you stop reacting, stop proving, stop explaining, you become unpredictable. You beat the avoidant by becoming what they fear the most, unavailable to their push-pull tactics. You don't become cold, you become clear. Because when your love has boundaries, it becomes a privilege, not a punishment. And suddenly, it's not you who's chasing anymore. It's them wondering how they lost the only person who ever saw them. But by then, you've evolved, and you don't go back to what you had to heal from. That's how the super empath wins. Empathy is often seen as a superpower. It allows people to feel deeply, connect meaningfully, and love wholeheartedly. But what happens when that superpower turns into a silent self-sabotage, when an empath gives and gives, not out of abundance, but out of fear? Fear of being left, fear of being unloved, fear of being too much or not enough. They begin to abandon themselves in the name of love. At first, it doesn't look like self-abandonment. It looks like compromise. It looks like compassion. You tell yourself they're just scared or they've been hurt before. You rationalize their inconsistency as complexity. You adjust your needs, silence your voice, and dim your light, all to make space for someone who never asked you to, but never stopped you either. And that's the trap. You confuse shrinking yourself with being emotionally generous. You confuse overfunctioning with loving well. The truth is, empathy without boundaries is not love. It's survival mode. It's a trauma response wrapped in kindness. When you start caring more about how someone else feels than how their behavior affects you, you've crossed into dangerous territory. You're no longer loving. You're negotiating your worth. You stay quiet so you don't scare them off. You show patience that isn't rooted in peace, but in the hope that your loyalty will finally earn you stability. You're not being kind. You're being compliant. And there's a world of difference between the two. Empaths often carry a deep belief that love must be proven, that if they're just good enough, calm enough, forgiving enough, the other person will finally feel safe enough to stay. But that belief leads to emotional overinvestment. You begin to take responsibility for someone else's fear, detachment, and avoidance. You start managing both sides of the relationship. You make excuses for their silence. You adjust your expectations to match their limitations. And in doing so, you abandon the part of yourself that knows you deserve more. There's a cost to this kind of empathy, and the bill always comes due. It shows up as anxiety. It shows up as resentment. It shows up in late night overthinking, wondering why someone else's comfort matters more than your needs. You start to feel invisible in the very relationship you're working so hard to hold together. Because that's what happens when you put someone else's emotional safety above your own self-respect. You disappear. The hardest part is that empaths often feel like they're doing the right thing. They think their love is healing, that their presence is soothing, that their tolerance is noble. But real love doesn't ask you to erase yourself. Real love meets you halfway. And empathy, when used without boundaries, invites in the wrong kind of people, those who take without giving, who need without appreciating, who flee intimacy but still expect access to your heart. At some point, the super empath has to realize that their ability to feel deeply doesn't mean they have to feel for everyone. That saying no more is not a betrayal of love, but an act of self-love. Because the moment you start setting boundaries around your empathy, it doesn't make you less loving, it makes your love more sacred. Avoidants operate in a cycle. They crave connection just enough to pull you in, but fear intimacy enough to push you away the moment it starts to feel real. Their emotional rhythm is inconsistent. hot, then cold, then lukewarm. This pattern isn't random, it's a psychological strategy, whether they're aware of it or not. It's how they maintain control in a relationship while keeping vulnerability at bay. The person on the receiving end, especially someone highly empathetic, is left in a constant state of emotional confusion, always trying to decode the shifts in behavior. And that confusion is exactly where the avoidant feels safest when you're off balance and reaching for them. What gives the avoidant power is predictability, not their own, but yours. They depend on your need for connection. They expect that every time they pull back, you will lean in. That when they grow distant, you will grow desperate. This predictability gives them emotional leverage. It confirms that they can have closeness on their own terms without ever being truly accountable for how their distance affects you. It allows them to keep you close enough to feel wanted, but far enough to never feel exposed. The moment you stop reacting the way they expect, the dynamic begins to shift. When you stop chasing, stop explaining, stop filling the silence they create, you disrupt the game. They don't know what to do with a person who doesn't beg for breadcrumbs. Your non-response becomes the loudest message you could send. Because now, the avoidant doesn't just feel your absence, they feel a loss of control. That unpredictability, that calm withdrawal is what breaks their emotional routine. It's not punishment, it's power, the kind that comes from self-awareness. Most avoidants aren't cruel. They're just afraid of being seen too closely, afraid of needing someone and being disappointed. But fear doesn't excuse behavior that harms another. And when you continue to play your part in the cycle, you inadvertently reinforce the belief that love equals emotional pursuit. You end up training them that they can withdraw love, affection, or attention, and you will still show up with open arms. That you will interpret inconsistency as complexity instead of as avoidance. So when you stop being predictable, you stop playing the role they've assigned to you. You start acting from self-respect instead of fear of abandonment. You no longer overfunction to keep the relationship afloat. You allow the silence to stand without rushing to fill it. You give them the space they say they want, and you use it to reconnect with your own sense of peace. That shift doesn't just change how they see you, it changes how you see yourself. You realize you never had to prove your worth through emotional labor in the first place. Unpredictability, in this context, isn't about playing games. It's about breaking the pattern. It's about no longer being emotionally available to someone who disappears when things get real. When you stop reacting the way they expect, you take back your emotional agency. And that is what truly disrupts the avoidance game. There comes a moment in every empath's life when the exhaustion outweighs the hope. It happens quietly, after one too many times of being left on read, after a conversation where your feelings were dismissed, after realizing you're always the one trying to make things work. That's when something clicks. You stop asking, what more can I do to make them stay? And start asking, why am I the only one trying at all? And in that moment, you begin to heal, not because they changed, but because you did. Empaths are wired to give. It's instinctive. They want people to feel seen, heard, understood. But this gift becomes a curse when it's given to someone who can't reciprocate, or worse, to someone who uses your compassion as an excuse to avoid accountability. When you constantly prioritize someone else's emotional comfort over your own needs, you start to disappear in the relationship. You start bending so much to meet them where they are, you forget where you stand. And what's left is a version of you that's exhausted, anxious, and disconnected from your own sense of worth. Choosing yourself doesn't come easy when your identity is wrapped in being the one who cares more. You've learned to be proud of your emotional resilience, of how much you can hold for someone else. But that's not love. That's performance. That's working for closeness instead of receiving it. The truth is, you don't have to prove your worth through sacrifice. You don't have to earn love by being the most patient, most forgiving, most understanding person in the room. Healthy love doesn't demand that kind of suffering. When you begin to heal, you start seeing things clearly. You realize that someone avoiding intimacy isn't a reflection of your inadequacy. It's a reflection of their own internal battles. Their inconsistency wasn't your fault. Their coldness wasn't a test you were supposed to pass. Their emotional unavailability wasn't your problem to fix. And with that realization comes liberation. You start releasing the shame. You start reclaiming your energy. You stop waiting for them to give you the love you were always willing to give them. Healing doesn't make you hard. It makes you discerning. You no longer feel the need to chase clarity from people who communicate through mixed signals. You stop taking silence personally. You stop translating emotional neglect into a challenge to be solved. Instead, you sit with your discomfort. You face your loneliness. And in doing so, you develop the kind of inner strength that doesn't require external validation. The healed empath becomes someone who knows that love should not feel like a battle for attention. They become someone who understands that peace isn't found in getting someone to stay. It's found in no longer abandoning yourself to keep someone in your life. You stop playing therapist. You stop managing their moods. You stop building a home in a space that only ever offered you temporary shelter. You realize your empathy is a gift, but only when it's directed toward people who are capable of respecting it. That's the shift. That's how healing turns self-sacrifice into self-respect. There's a quiet kind of strength that doesn't look like power at first. It's not loud, not flashy, not about winning the argument or proving your point. It doesn't involve slamming doors or cutting people off just to make a statement. No. It's the kind of strength that comes from walking away without needing to be right. It's the strength of graceful detachment, and it's far more powerful than cold revenge could ever be. When someone has hurt you, especially someone you care deeply for, the instinct to retaliate can feel overwhelming. You want them to know they were wrong. You want them to understand how much they damaged you. You might imagine them regretting everything, begging for a second chance, finally realizing what they lost. But here's the truth, that desire to be seen, to be acknowledged, often keeps you emotionally hooked long after the relationship has ended. It becomes another form of attachment, just wearing a different mask. Cold revenge might feel good for a moment, sending the angry text, posting something pointed on social media, or cutting them off without explanation may deliver an immediate sense of power, but it rarely brings peace. It keeps the cycle alive. You stay emotionally entangled with someone you are trying to free yourself from. Your energy still revolves around how they feel, what they think, what they'll do next. That's not power. That's emotional captivity dressed up as strength. Graceful detachment, on the other hand, is about reclaiming your center. It's not passive, it's intentional. It's the decision to remove yourself from a situation that no longer serves your well-being, not because you want to hurt the other person, but because you finally realize your peace is more important than their validation. It's choosing not to react when they pull away, not to chase when they go silent, not to explain yourself to someone who never really listened in the first place. There's dignity in choosing silence where chaos once reigned. When you detach with grace, you don't shrink or lash out, you rise. You create space between who you are and what they made you feel. You stop trying to manage their discomfort and start protecting your own peace. That doesn't mean you're indifferent. It means you've matured beyond needing closure from someone who couldn't offer you clarity even when they were close. One of the most powerful things you can ever say to someone without uttering a word is, "You no longer have access to me." Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. That energy, that unbothered presence speaks volumes. It communicates that you've outgrown the emotional games, that you've stopped tying your identity to how much someone needs or wants you, that your healing no longer depends on someone else's recognition of your pain. And while revenge is rooted in the past, in trying to make someone feel what you felt, grace is rooted in the future, in deciding who you want to be and no longer letting old wounds make your choices for you. Graceful detachment says, "I deserve peace more than I deserve justice." And in that quiet, steady choice, you win something far greater than the last word. You win yourself back. When a super empath begins to heal, something irreversible happens. They don't just shift their behavior, they shift their identity. They stop seeing themselves as the fixer, the healer, the one who always has to hold space for everyone else's wounds. They start recognizing that their softness isn't meant for those who weaponize it. Their love isn't meant to be handed out to people who only show up when it's convenient. And in that realization, they evolve. For a long time, empaths will revisit situations that hurt them, not because they miss the pain, but because they miss the potential. They remember the moments of connection, the glimmers of what could have been if the other person had only stepped up, only let them in, only chosen them. That hope, The belief that love can still win if they just try hard enough is what keeps them going back. But healing forces a confrontation with reality, not the fantasy of who someone could be, but the truth of who they consistently showed themselves to be. Eventually, the empath understands you cannot rewrite someone's emotional capacity by loving them harder. You cannot teach them to stay by showing them how loyal you are. And you certainly cannot make someone choose you who benefits from your insecurity. Once this lands fully in their heart, the empath doesn't just walk away, they rise. They stop trying to be chosen by someone who couldn't see their value and start living like someone who no longer needs outside permission to be worthy. The most dangerous thing about a healed empath is their clarity. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. They no longer believe they have to earn affection. They don't beg. They don't chase. They don't send one last text hoping for a different outcome. They've seen the pattern too many times, and now they've chosen not to participate, and that shift changes everything. For the avoidant or emotionally unavailable person who once had control, this is where the script flips. They expect the empath to return. They expect another chance. But the empath who has done the inner work doesn't circle back. Not out of spite, but out of wisdom. They understand that healing means refusing to re-enter a space that forced them to question their worth. They don't open old doors just because someone finally noticed they were gone. The healed empath isn't bitter. They're not guarded in a way that keeps love out. They're open, but discerning. They've learned that access to them is a privilege, not a given. And they don't offer that privilege to people who once made them feel like an option. They want love that's consistent, safe, and mutual, not love that feels like a gamble. They want to be chosen without having to constantly prove they're worth choosing. So when the past comes knocking, they don't answer, not because they're angry, but because they're free. They've found peace, and they're not willing to trade it for another round of emotional chaos. They don't need closure. They are the closure and the version of themselves that once stayed too long in situations that hurt. That version no longer exists because the super empath has evolved, and once they do, they don't go back. So to every super empath out there, know this: your depth is not a weakness, it's a gift. But a gift isn't meant to be wasted on those who can't receive it with care. You don't win by loving the emotionally unavailable. You win by no longer playing a game that requires you to abandon yourself just to stay in it. The day you stop chasing someone who's running from intimacy, the day you stop explaining your worth to someone committed to misunderstanding it, the day you reclaim your energy and pour it back into you, that's the day you win. That's the day you become untouchable in the best way. Because the healed empath is not colder, just wiser, not closed off, just more intentional. They don't need revenge. They don't need to be right. They just walk forward quietly, confidently, and free. Thank you for listening, for showing up, for being the kind